On August 2nd, 2026, the city of Yongsan in southeastern South Korea recorded a temperature of 42.5 degrees Celsius, the hottest reading in the country's 122-year history of weather observation. 2 days later, President Lee Jae-myung stood in front of his cabinet and called it what it was: a national disaster. By August 6th, the death toll had climbed to 23, with more than 2,600 people treated for heat-related illness. Seoul issued its first-ever severe heatwave warning covering the entire capital. Baseball games were canceled outright. Fans collapsed in the stands before officials even managed to shut a stadium down. And this isn't an isolated national story. Across the Sea of Japan, extreme heat is simultaneously complicating earthquake recovery efforts in Kyushu. Further south and west, a heat dome has been sitting over India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan since April, pushing temperatures past 100 degrees Fahrenheit for months on end. This is not three separate countries having a rough summer at the same time by coincidence. This is a genuine, atmospherically connected heat event stretching across an enormous portion of Asia, and the scale of what's unfolding right now deserves a serious, detailed breakdown rather than a passing headline. Today, we're going through exactly what's happening in South Korea, how it connects to the wider pattern across Japan and South Asia, the atmospheric mechanism actually driving all of it, and what millions of people across the region are facing in the weeks ahead. Drop a comment right now. If you're anywhere in Asia experiencing this heat directly, tell me where and what it's actually felt like on the ground. And if you want the update the moment this pattern shifts, subscribe right now. It's free. A thumbs up helps enormously. Let's get this to 5,000 likes so it reaches the people who need to see it. Now let's get into it. South Korea, a 122-year record and a system in genuine crisis. What's happening in South Korea right now is not a routine hot summer. It's a full-scale national emergency response. The Korea Meteorological Administration confirmed that Yongsan, an inland city sitting in a basin geography that traps and concentrates heat, hit 42.5 degrees Celsius, or roughly 108 degrees Fahrenheit, breaking a temperature record that had stood since the country began keeping weather records in 1904. Seoul itself issued its first ever severe heatwave warning for the entire capital, a designation that instructs residents to suspend outdoor work, farming, and sports activity entirely. The human toll has been immediate and severe. As of the most recent tally, the Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency reported 23 suspected heat-related deaths, with the majority of victims aged 80 or older, the population most vulnerable to extreme heat exposure. More than 2,600 people have sought emergency medical treatment for heat-related illness since the crisis began. President Lee Jae-myung didn't mince words in his response, describing the situation as a national climate disaster and specifically warning that abnormal weather conditions make it highly likely extreme heat. Like this becomes a recurring rather than occasional national challenge going forward. He's since ordered a fundamental redesign of the country's disaster response system to handle conditions of this severity as an ongoing reality rather than a rare exception. The disruption has reached deep into everyday life in ways that make the scale of this event tangible. The Korea Baseball Organization canceled entire slates of scheduled games after fans collapsed in the stands during play, and has now permanently adopted automatic game suspension protocols under a new severe heatwave warning system, a genuine institutional redesign triggered directly by this event. Zoo animals have died from heat exposure. Firefighters have been dispatched to spray water on roads and check on vulnerable residents in lower-income housing districts where air conditioning access remains limited. This is what a heat emergency looks like when it moves from forecast to lived reality across an entire country simultaneously. Japan. Heat compounding an already difficult recovery. Just across the Sea of Japan, the same extreme heat pattern is layering directly on top of an active disaster recovery effort. Japan has spent recent weeks working through the aftermath of a significant earthquake sequence in Kyushu, and now extreme heat is actively complicating that recovery, adding heat stress risk for recovery workers, residents in damaged housing without functioning air conditioning, and emergency responders already stretched by post-earthquake logistics. When a natural hazard event and an extreme heat event overlap in the same region at the same time, each one makes the other measurably harder to manage. Recovery crews face heat exhaustion, risk on top of structural hazards, and displaced residents in temporary or damaged housing face extreme heat exposure without the infrastructure they'd normally rely on to stay safe. South Asia, a heat dome that never really left. While South Korea's crisis has unfolded rapidly over a matter of days, South Asia has been living inside sustained, punishing heat since early spring. A severe and prolonged heat wave has gripped India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan since early April, with temperatures across the region regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and in parts of southern Afghanistan, reaching as high as 109 degrees Fahrenheit for extended stretches. Forecasts through the spring and summer consistently pointed to above normal heat wave activity persisting across the region until seasonal monsoon rainfall finally arrives to bring relief, meaning large parts of South Asia have now spent close to 5 consecutive months under sustained extreme heat conditions rather than experiencing a short, sharp event. This is the kind of heat exposure that tends to receive less international coverage than a sudden record-breaking spike, precisely because it's sustained rather than dramatic in any single moment. But sustained extreme heat over months carries its own distinct danger profile, cumulative strain on agricultural systems, water supplies, and power grids that a short, intense heat wave doesn't produce in the same way, along with prolonged health risk for outdoor workers and vulnerable populations who simply don't get the recovery period that a shorter event would allow. The mechanism connecting all of it, here's the atmospheric science tying these regional stories together into a genuine continental scale pattern rather than a coincidence of separate national heat waves. Heat domes form when a slow-moving high-pressure system parks itself over a region and effectively traps the air beneath it. Clear skies under the high allow intense solar heating to reach the surface uninterrupted. That heated air rises, only to be pushed back down by the high pressure above, and as it's compressed on the way back down, it warms further still, a recirculation process that makes the air beneath the dome progressively hotter the longer the system stays in place. Crucially, this same high-pressure blocking pattern deflects passing weather systems and rain-bearing clouds around the edges of the dome rather than allowing them to move through, which is exactly why heat domes tend to produce prolonged multi-week events rather than the kind of heat that breaks after a day or two. This isn't a mechanism unique to Asia this year. It's the same fundamental atmospheric setup that has driven extreme, record-challenging heat across Europe throughout this summer, where a persistent omega block pattern has repeatedly locked heat domes over the Iberian Peninsula, France, and Central Europe, pushing temperatures past 40 degrees Celsius across multiple countries. What's happening across South Korea, Japan, and South Asia reflects the same broad-scale pattern of persistent, blocking high-pressure systems, establishing themselves across the Northern Hemisphere's mid-latitudes this year, playing out independently across different longitudes, but sharing the same underlying atmospheric mechanism. Why this year specifically looks different? Climate researchers studying this pattern have pointed to a specific structural trend behind why blocking heat domes like this are becoming more frequent and more severe. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that atmospheric blocking events of the type producing these extended heat waves have nearly tripled in frequency since the 1950s, a shift researchers attribute to changes in the temperature gradient between the tropics and the Arctic altering how the jet stream behaves. A weaker temperature contrast between the poles and the equator makes the jet stream slower and wavier, which allows high-pressure ridges to lock in place over a region for far longer than they would under a faster, more zonal jet stream pattern. That's the structural backdrop behind both the summer's extended European heat events and the current pattern gripping large parts of Asia. Layered on top of that structural trend is a strengthening El Niño, which the World Meteorological Organization has placed at over 95% probability of continuing into early 2027, with confidence in a very strong event through the final months of this year. El Niño doesn't create heat domes directly, but it tends to reinforce the kind of high-pressure blocking patterns and prolonged warmth that regions across the Northern Hemisphere have been experiencing throughout this year, adding an additional amplifying layer on top of an already primed atmospheric setup. Who is actually most at risk right now? The populations facing the most immediate danger from this pattern share common characteristics across every region it's touching. Elderly residents, particularly those living without reliable air conditioning, account for the overwhelming majority of confirmed heat deaths in South Korea's current crisis, mirroring the pattern seen in nearly every major heat disaster globally. Outdoor workers across construction, agriculture, and logistics face serious heat stress risk during peak afternoon hours in every affected region, from Seoul to rural Pakistan. Lower-income urban residents living in housing with limited cooling infrastructure, like the Jokbang housing districts of Seoul, specifically highlighted during this crisis, face disproportionate exposure with fewer options to escape it. And in regions like Kyushu, where heat is compounding an active earthquake recovery, displaced or temporarily housed residents face a genuinely compounded risk that neither hazard alone would produce. What actually helps right now, the practical guidance here is straightforward and consistent across every region caught inside this pattern. Check on elderly neighbors and family members, particularly those without air conditioning, since isolation combined with heat exposure is the single most common factor behind heat-related deaths in events like this one. If you work outdoors, take heat warning seriously and adjust hours where possible, since South Korea's own heat wave alerts explicitly call for suspending outdoor farming, sports, and construction activity during the most dangerous hours. Stay hydrated and know the warning signs of heat exhaustion and heat stroke, dizziness, nausea, confusion, and stop outdoor activity immediately if they appear. And if you're in an affected region, follow your local weather agency's alerts directly rather than relying solely on international coverage, since agencies like the Korea Meteorological Administration and India's IMD are issuing real-time, localized guidance that updates faster than any single video can. South Korea just recorded its hottest temperature in 122 years of measurement. South Asia has now spent nearly 5 months under sustained extreme heat. Japan is managing a heat crisis and an earthquake recovery at the same time. These are not disconnected national stories that happen to be sharing a news cycle. They're regional expressions of the same atmospheric mechanism, persistent high-pressure blocking, playing out across an enormous stretch of the northern hemisphere. This year, reinforced by a structural trend toward more frequent blocking events and amplified by a strengthening El Niño. Millions of people across this region are living through the consequences of that pattern right now, and the honest scientific picture says this kind of event is becoming more frequent, not less, as the underlying atmospheric conditions driving it continue to shift. We'll keep tracking this closely across every region it's touching. Subscribe so you don't miss the update the moment this pattern shifts. And drop that comment. Tell me what conditions look like where you are. Let's get this to 5,000 likes so it reaches the people who need to see it. See you in the next one.